The Silent House. It started as an innocent visit to the countryside, a weekend retreat to an old family farmhouse that had been abandoned for decades. The house had been left in disrepair after the tragic disappearance of its former owner, a man named Victor Callahan. Victor was a reclusive figure in the small rural town of Oak Ridge, known to keep to himself and rarely be seen in public. One day, without warning, he simply vanished. Victor's disappearance remained unsolved. Many believed he had left town or met some tragic end, while others whispered about dark secrets that might still linger within the walls of the old house. That's when Emily, a young journalist with a passion for uncovering mysteries, found herself drawn to the story. She wanted to learn more, to uncover the truth behind the legend. Emily arrived at the house just as dusk settled over the land. The air felt unnaturally still, and the shadows of the looming trees seemed to stretch toward the house, as if trying to warn her away. Her footsteps echoed on the creaking wooden floorboards as she entered the house. Inside, everything was eerily preserved, a time capsule of the past. Dusty photographs hung on the walls, depicting Victor and his family. His wife and child, both long gone, smiled serenely in the frames. But the farther Emily went inside, the more unsettling things became. First, it was the whispering. At first, she thought it was the wind, but there was no wind, no breeze, and the sound was unmistakably human. It seemed to come from the walls, low, incoherent muttering that made her skin crawl. But when she tried to follow the sound, it would disappear, only to return from a different part of the house. Determined to uncover the truth, Emily pressed on, exploring the decaying rooms. She found a series of journals hidden beneath a loose floorboard in what appeared to be a child's room. They belonged to Victor. As she read through them, her heart began to race. The entries started out mundane, but grew darker with time. Victor had written about strange happenings in the house, starting shortly after his family's death in a fire that had claimed his wife and son. He spoke of hearing their voices, seeing their shadows, feeling their presence, as though they had never truly left. One night, as she sat in the old living room reading the journals, the whispers returned, louder now, clearer. They seemed to be calling her name. Trembling, she followed the sound up the stairs to the attic. She found an old rusted door that had been locked for decades. Her heart pounded as she pried it open. Inside, she discovered a small, secret room. The air was thick and damp, and the walls were covered in dark stains. In the corner of the room, she saw something that made her blood run cold. An old wooden chair with heavy chains bolted to the floor. There was no sign of a body, but the room reeked of death. On the wall, carved into the wood with deep scratches, was the word silence. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. The air turned frigid, and the whispers grew deafening. Emily realized she wasn't alone in the room. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the house itself had swallowed her voice. Panic set in as she felt cold fingers brush against her neck. In a desperate attempt to escape, she fumbled with her phone to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, and there, in the reflection of a dusty mirror, she saw Victor. His face was twisted in agony, his eyes hollow and dark. But worse than Victor were the others, his wife, his child. Their burned, contorted forms stared at her from the shadows. Emily scrambled for the door, her heart pounding, her breath ragged. She pulled and yanked, and finally, it flew open. She ran down the stairs, past the portraits that now seemed to watch her with sinister intent. The house groaned and creaked, as if it were alive, as if it were trying to keep her inside. She barely made it out. As she reached her car and sped away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. There, standing at the window, she saw them, the family, watching her leave. For days after her escape, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her. It wasn't just in her mind. The whispers continued, faint at first, but growing louder every night. And the dreams. In her nightmares, she was back in that room, chained to the chair, unable to scream. Weeks passed, and Emily vanished, just like Victor. The town knew better than to search for her. They knew that once the house had you, it never let you go. Now, locals say they can hear her voice, a soft whispering echoing from within the house, forever trapped in the silence. Months had passed since Emily disappeared, and Oak Ridge was no stranger to rumors. Whispers of haunted woods, strange lights, and the cursed Callahan house had always been part of the town's folklore. But Emily's disappearance brought the old stories back to life, fueling fears that the house still held dark secrets. Most locals wouldn't go near it, but there were always those who felt drawn to the unknown. One of them was Daniel, Emily's younger brother. He was devastated by her disappearance, but even more so by the lack of action from the police and the townspeople. They told him the same thing over and over. She's gone, like the others. No one could give him an answer that made sense. What had happened to her? How could she just vanish without a trace? Daniel wasn't ready to give up. He knew Emily had been investigating something connected to the house, and he was determined to find her. As the days passed, his obsession grew. He spent hours in the local library, digging through old newspapers, talking to anyone who might know something about the Callahan family, trying to piece together what had happened. What he discovered was even more chilling than the rumors. In the years before Victor's disappearance, several other mysterious incidents had occurred. People who visited the house often reported strange occurrences, missing time, lost memories, and vivid nightmares. There were accounts of children wandering into the house and coming back different, unable to explain what had happened to them. But the most disturbing pattern was the disappearances. Over the years, several people had gone missing near the house, and their bodies were never found. The town had kept quiet, and many of the stories were buried over time, fading into legend. One rainy evening, Daniel found an old diary that had belonged to Victor's wife, Margaret. It had been kept in a sealed box, preserved by the library's archives. The entries started as mundane accounts of family life, tending to the garden, raising their son, Charles, and the ordinary ups and downs of rural living. But as he read on, Daniel's pulse quickened. Margaret had written about strange happenings in the house long before the fire that claimed her and Charles's lives. It began with the sound of footsteps in the night, despite no one else being awake. Then there were the voices, faint, indistinct at first, but growing louder over time. They would come from the walls, the attic, even from the cracks in the floor. Margaret became convinced that something else was living in the house with them, but Victor dismissed her concerns, brushing it off as her imagination. However, one entry caught Daniel's attention. It described an old chest in the attic, locked tight with an iron clasp. Margaret had found it hidden behind old furniture one day while cleaning, but when she asked Victor about it, he became uncharacteristically agitated. He forbade her from opening it, saying it was best left undisturbed. That was the last mention of the chest before Margaret's diary abruptly ended. Daniel's mind raced. What was inside that chest? Could it be connected to Emily's disappearance? With renewed determination, he made up his mind. He was going to the Callahan house. The day Daniel set out to visit the house, the weather mirrored his mood. Overcast, with dark clouds looming overhead. The drive felt longer than it should have, with every mile stretching out like a warning. When he finally arrived, the house stood as it always had. Quiet, decaying, its windows like hollow eyes staring back at him. Stepping out of his car, Daniel felt a sense of dread wash over him. The air was thick and cold, despite the warmth of the season. He could feel the weight of the house's history pressing down on him, as though the building itself was aware of his presence. The front door creaked open with little resistance, as if inviting him in. Inside, the stale air carried the faint scent of damp wood and mold. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners like curtains. The house was exactly as Emily had described it in her notes. A forgotten relic of the past, but somehow still alive with an unshakable malevolence. Daniel wasted no time. He went straight for the attic. The stairs groaned beneath his weight as he climbed, and the temperature dropped the higher he went. By the time he reached the attic, his breath was visible in the cold air, despite the warmth outside. His flashlight flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. At the far end of the attic, just as Margaret's diary described, was the chest. It was old, covered in dust, and its iron clasp was rusted, but still intact. Kneeling in front of it, Daniel felt his heart race. He reached for the clasp, hesitating for a moment as a sense of foreboding gripped him. But he had come this far. He couldn't turn back now. The clasp gave way with a rusty screech. The chest creaked open, and inside was nothing. Just an empty space, lined with rotting fabric. Daniel's heart sank. Was this it? Had he come all this way for nothing? But then the whispers began. At first they were faint, barely audible above the creaking of the house, but they grew louder, more insistent. Daniel spun around, his flashlight scanning the attic, but there was no one there. His pulse quickened as the whispers seemed to surround him, coming from every corner of the room. And then he saw it. In the shadows by the old mirror, something moved, a shape, a figure, barely visible in the dim light. His breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped closer, its form becoming clearer. It was Victor. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow, just as Emily had described in her notes. But there was something else. Behind him, in the darkness, were other shapes, more figures, more shadows, all watching him with silent, hollow eyes. Daniel's flashlight flickered and died, plunging the attic into darkness. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping voices, indistinguishable, but filled with anger, with pain. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest, desperately trying to find the stairs. But the house wasn't letting him go. Just like Emily, Daniel felt the air grow thick, the weight of unseen hands pressing down on him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figures moved closer, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. And then in the silence, he heard one voice above the rest. "Welcome home,"